World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dimitri Kalugin here with a huge week of World War III analysis, our 103rd episode here. We're getting well into 2025 at this point, so some of these things like the potential end of the war in Ukraine, of course, Trump's inauguration, so many things that have been discussed over the past years are kind of starting to unfold here in our current epoch. And we're going to be talking all about the Gaza ceasefire, the potential collapse of the Israeli government as certain right-wing factions are not happy about what they are claiming is, a total retreat. We're going to be talking about the Houthis and whether or not they're going to be stopping their Red Sea blockade, the Lebanon ceasefire in that situation as well. And of course, the new comprehensive deal signed between Russia and Iran, the growing rift between Iran and Turkey, how Russia is responding to all of that, of course, from the prophetic perspective. We're going to be talking about the whole Kurdish situation and, de facto Kurdistan and Iraq and Syria. We're going to obviously get into what's actually going on in Ukraine and Russia with Pokrovsk as it's continuing to be surrounded and approached. Some major pipeline gas energy issues going on with Transnistria, attempts made on the Turkstream pipeline. And of course, we're going to be wading into the elections that are coming up in Europe, as well as the upcoming TikTok ban in the US, Trump's impending inauguration, of course, and a number of other World War III related issues on some other fronts. So packed episode, of course. We're going to dive right into it. Dimitri, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. And of course, it is a very important week. And not only are we approaching Theophany, the feast day for those on the Julian calendar, the old school original calendar, but we also have the inauguration of Donald J. Trump, around which it seems almost as if the entire world, all foreign policy spins around it, like in the Galileo Galilean model. Everything goes around the sun. In this particular case, it seems like all the various nations and even groups, even some certain organizations designated as terrorists, such as Ansar Allah, al-Houthis, and even the Israeli Zionist state, as well as Hamas, are all looking at this particular event and making very important decisions. So this week, of course, the greatest piece of news, I believe, would be the Gaza ceasefire, which officially has been agreed upon in Doha, Qatar. So again, notice Qatar, the main nation responsible for toppling the Assad government, mind you. They were the main sponsors of ISIS, all these various Wahhabi, Salafi, Sunni groups, including the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, which the Assad government tried to suppress for many years. Qatar is also one of the countries which has been assisting Hamas over the last few decades, to put it lightly, or at least since the Hamas has come around as an organization. And this is why Doha, Qatar, which we've covered over the last few months, has been the staging ground for certain peace talks between Israel and the United States. Anthony Blinken, of course, was in Doha, the capital of Qatar, several times late last year. And again, coming up to Christmas, we almost thought that perhaps there won't be any peace talks, or that Netanyahu and the Israeli Zionists would, of course, fight their way to sort of a completion of their plans, whatever it was, possibly for a complete genocide of the Gaza Palestinians, or perhaps an ousting of them or pushing them out into the Sinai desert of Egypt. But it appears that Hamas representatives, as well as middle people such as US ambassadors and spokespersons, and of course those from Israel, have come to an agreement. This was, of course, shortly after the agreement, which is still somewhat on shaky grounds, between Hezbollah and Israel. And now finally the Hamas/Palestine and Israel agreement has been signed and sort of agreed upon. It will come into power on the 19th of January. And of course, officially speaking, there will be a 126-day three-phase process, each phase lasting up to 42 days. Essentially, it will accommodate an exchange of those hostages still remaining in Hamas Palestinian captivity in the Gaza Strip, typically hidden in underground bunkers, most likely some of those very elaborate tunnel systems that Hamas has built up over decades. And I would say not just Hamas, but probably other Palestinian groups which have been resisting Israel and preparing for a sort of Armageddon-type apocalyptic battle against their Zionist oppressors for many years. And in these tunnels, these hostages, of course, have remained for quite a while now, almost a year at this point. And over several phases, they will be exchanged to Palestinian hostages and prisoners being held in Israeli prisons. What's interesting, Conrad, is the fact that at first, the main prisoners that will be allowed and released the Palestinian prisoners who, of course, are women and children. So these are children, those under the age of 18. So there was a lot of teenagers who Israelis have arrested in North Gaza and all around the Gaza Strip when they've entered, because maybe some of these youngsters were throwing rocks and things at the Israeli troops and tanks. And of course, they were taken into custody and held literally without any legal representation or any sort of support outside of any sort of as you can imagine, they're children. They can't really consent or speak to any of these matters. And they were held in various prisons around Israel. They'll be released. A lot of women will be released. And last but not least, there will be also men, Palestinian fighters, and potentially even members of Hamas that will be traded for these hostages that the Palestinians have held in their captivity for a while. What's interesting is, of course, that there's no mention of exactly which member of Hamas has agreed to these particular terms. Most likely, it was not without the consent of Mohammed Sinwar, who was probably the main Hamas Mujahideen warlord at the moment, who has control of the Gaza Strip. He's the brother of Yahya Sinwar, but in some ways, as much as Yahya Sinwar was a politician, Mohammed Sinwar is almost like a general, speaking in military terms. He's had almost formal military training, and he's in charge of the military branch of the Palestinians in Gaza, at least those who are members of Hamas. So Mohammed Sinwar was most likely the one who had to consent to this peace talk. There are a lot of course, discussions, Conrad, around the fact that, will this 126-day process, the 3 phases, the exchange of deceased bodies, the burials, the rebuilding of Gaza, and the future blueprint. Of course, there's a 3 to 5 year blueprint after this 126-day process of northern Gaza, especially, but central Gaza too, being rebuilt in collaboration with the Israeli government and actually Israeli corporations and companies. So it seems like both sides have come to some sort of agreement that perhaps there needs to be an end to the death of innocent Palestinians, and perhaps even those Israelis in the government who don't wish their own children, their sons and daughters who are serving in the IDF, who have to go into these very dangerous streets and essentially into foreign Palestinian land where the Palestinians dislike them very heavily. And there's been a lot of Israeli casualties, probably in the thousands at this point, although we don't know the true numbers. And officially, the Palestinian death count up to now, now the ceasefire taking place tomorrow or in 2 days' time, technically, the death count for Palestine has been 46,000 officially. We know, however, Conrad, the death count is most likely over 100,000, perhaps closer to 200,000 if you count the people not having access to medication. Of course, they destroyed hospitals, people just dying from complications that have arisen from the Israeli invasion of the Gaza Strip in the first place. And of course, we've seen literally children starve as well, like photographs that you would have imagined they were taken from the Holodomor or some of the other famines that took place under the wise leadership of Jugashvili Stalin in the 1930s and late 1920s in the USSR. So there's some really gruesome information. But I think the last point I wanted to make very briefly was the fact that Israel, in its devilish and I would just say very sinful fashion, hypocritically speaking, just the last few days before the ceasefire will officially kick in on paper, has been ruthlessly targeting key places around Gaza, especially where there's been a large conglomeration of people, even homes and houses where they're targeting these senior Hamas leaders, where they're suspecting this particular house or that particular compound or this particular tent or camp has a certain Hamas militant fighter, and they're just lobbing bombs from their planes, firing missiles at these crowds. And there's been, as you mentioned, off air, 50, probably closer to 80 deaths already, or 100 deaths just in the last few days. So tens of deaths every single day leading up to the ceasefire. Typically speaking, if there's a war, you'd imagine that both sides would begin phasing out sort of military contact prior to the ceasefire, but not in this case. It seems like the Zionists have their own sort of recipe of how to implement a long-lasting ceasefire and a sort of immortal permanency of peace, right? Which, again, we know this is most likely, this won't be the case. This is only probably a short-term peace if you think about the Palestine situation in its sort of historical context.
Unfortunately, I think that you're right. And as far as the ongoing bombardment goes here in the last, the twilight hour of the pre-ceasefire, war, this is from the United Nations Human Rights Council. They condemned Israel's continued bombardment of Gaza, stating, "We are dismayed that shortly after the deal was announced, Israel continued bombing Gaza indiscriminately, killing Palestinian civilians despite expectations of calm until the ceasefire takes effect." There's even, videos and stuff of people celebrating the ceasefire that then came under, Israeli bombardment. So really egregious stuff. And as far as the fallout in Israeli society goes, of course, obviously, certain factions, Netanyahu himself is trying to rally his coalition around this. The chief of Mossad, David Barnea, fully supports this. And, he's many would say to the left of Netanyahu. Meanwhile, the most vocal opponent of this was, of course, National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who in a last-minute plea for his fellow ministers to reject the proposal, this is from antiwar.com, he said, "Everyone knows that these terrorists will try and harm again, try to kill again." He continued in the video statement, "I shall call on my friends in the Likud and religious Zionist parties. It is not yet too late. We still have the cabinet meeting. We can stop this deal." And even members of Netanyahu's party in Likud, they actually, one of them, David Amsalem, for example, he joined the far-right ministers from the religious Zionism and Ben-Gvir's party, Otzma Yehudit, in voting against the deal. And Ben-Gvir said that he might end up leaving the cabinet. However, he would still make sure that his votes went towards Netanyahu to remain prime minister, because obviously he knows that if Netanyahu's not the prime minister, they're getting some more liberal Israeli. But Smotrich, for example, he was convinced to stay in the coalition. The Knesset recently voted on it and it passed despite, all these objections. This was after it was signed in Doha. But Netanyahu has already indicated that he only intends to allow the first phase of the agreement to play out that Dimitri was talking about earlier. And according to Israel's Channel 12, the prime minister said during the security cabinet that Israel will likely resume fighting again after the first phase. And that was stated to get Smotrich to stay in the cabinet so that him and Ben-Gvir didn't both leave and cause Netanyahu to almost fully lose the support of the true Greater Israel ultra-Zionists who, again, Ben-Gvir talked about how he wanted to make sure that we settled northern Gaza and he wanted to ensure the release of the hostages not by ceasefire agreements and negotiations, but by preventing any kind of international humanitarian aid from entering into Gaza and then using that as a negotiating chip. So that shows you the kind of people that we're dealing with here. But we did see footage of the Al-Qassam brigades. They did, their equivalent of a military parade. They've got their trucks and their bandanas and their guns that they still managed to go through some of these cities. So those images were being used by the Israelis saying, see, this is viewed as a victory for Hamas. And of course, we know that the Palestinian Authority has become more and more emboldened and is trying to get empowered in the Gaza Strip as Hamas, continues to linger. So the question becomes, what exactly will the future actual governance of the Gaza Strip look like? And like you said, Dimitri, I wouldn't be surprised if eventually the pressure is back on and they realize they want to get back into northern Gaza. But the situation in southern Lebanon really isn't getting much better either, considering that ceasefire is, we're getting closer and closer. But this is from Jason Ditz as well, from Anti-War. He says, U.S. Special Envoy Amos Hochstein offered a guarantee over the weekend that Israel would fully withdraw from Lebanon by the 60-day ceasefire deadline. The U.S. official maintains this is still the plan, and with just 10 days left in the ceasefire, Major General Jasper Jeffers, the chairman of the U.S.-run body meant to oversee the ceasefire, claimed the pullout was on a very positive path. Meanwhile, though, we're seeing houses being demolished, Israel first invaded Taiba, for example, 2 weeks ago, burning a number of civilian homes and then, withdrawing. But just today, the troops and bulldozers returned. There's even reports of machine gun fire and others being leveled at residential neighborhoods. And some of these neighborhoods even have substantial Christian populations, which, of course, that makes it all the better for the Jews to start doing all of their bulldozing and whatnot. But of course, January 26th is when the ceasefire ends. And this is the final paragraph from this Jason Ditz article. It says, what will happen after January 6th is anyone's guess. Hezbollah officials have been warning their patience won't last if Israel remains after the deadline, and Israeli officials have been talking about ditching the ceasefire. As Israel has been violating the ceasefire multiple times daily, it's not clear what abandoning the ceasefire would actually mean. The next 10 days will be tense, and Israeli offensives will probably not stop. And of course, I'm sure Hezbollah is closely monitoring the situation in Gaza, but we've heard rumors that it was actually Erdogan putting pressure on Hamas that caused them to ultimately go along with this deal. And I'm not saying I know that is true 100%, but if that is true, and of course you said, Dimitri, the deal was signed in Qatar, it would appear that the axis of resistance might have to start taking matters into their own hands and not have their war that they are fighting for their existence and for Shia hegemony and relevance in their respective spheres. They may have to come up with a reason to fight Israel that isn't just defending Gaza. And of course, one of the biggest announcements that came, amidst all of this is that Yemen's Houthis claim that they are going to stop attacks on Israel if the Gaza ceasefire is implemented. And not just their attacks on Israel, but even the attacks on, for example, U.S. and other backed troops in the Red Sea. And this is from Dave DeCamp. It says the Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, began their attacks in 2023 in response to U.S.-backed Israeli onslaught in Gaza. The U.S. began a bombing campaign against the Yemeni group in January 2024, but it has only escalated the situation. Yemen's Houthis are expected to stop their attacks on Israel and Red Sea shipping if Israel upholds its end of the Gaza ceasefire deal that it has just reached with Hamas. President Biden's special envoy to Yemen, Tim Lenderking, has previously acknowledged that the Houthis would likely stop their attacks if there were a ceasefire in Gaza. On Thursday, Houthi leader Abdul Malik al-Houthi said Ansar Allah would monitor the ceasefire, which is expected to take effect on Sunday, and warned there would be more attacks if Israel didn't follow the deal. So those of you listening to the show, maybe, on Sunday, some of these things maybe the Houthis will decide that they don't want to stop and that they're going to keep going, but these things are going to be decided here in the next 48, 50 plus hours. And I think, again, Hezbollah, they're very crippled. The Houthis are facing a potential reignition of the Yemeni war with UAE and Saudi forces coming together to fight them again. We, of course, see Syria as a battleground where Turkey is gaining ground, where they may even be able to pressure the Kurds and Shia groups that are in Iraq. We even see Azerbaijan continuing to be weaponized against Iran. So in many ways, the Shia crescent and axis of resistance, they are in some fairly dire straits. And it seems like Hamas, unfortunately, was still much more willing to listen to their allies, their Sunni allies in Qatar and Turkey, as opposed to their allies in war against Israel, which were these Shia militias. So it's a very interesting development. I think, again, Turkey and Qatar's rise, they've been playing this in a much more realpolitik sense, whereas Iran, they've been on the back foot for so long. They've just been trying their best to maintain frame against Israel and the United States. I'm wondering your thoughts, Dimitri, on, the Yemen situation, and then as well as the situation in Lebanon, because we hear that Trump is actually going to become the first U.S. president to apparently visit Lebanon. We don't have a huge amount of details on that yet, but that would be quite the interesting development. And we hear that France is trying to take more credit for the recent presidential elections there. And I think they're trying to become relevant because Turkey is rising in the region so strongly, and the French certainly don't like that. And of course, in a second, we're going to talk about the Russian-Iranian deal and how we think Russia should respond to the Turkish stuff. But tell me your thoughts on the Houthis, on Lebanon, and perhaps on some of the other situations in the region.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You mentioned Trump, of course, visiting Beirut. Hypothetically, at least in the first few weeks of his presidency, it's the first foreign nation that he will visit as the inaugurated president of the United States, the 47th president, his second term. I think it's very interesting. Lebanon, a very key country. Notice it's between Syria and Israel. If he was to visit Damascus, people would look at that with eyebrows raised. It would kind of eliminate that factor of US as fighting sort of radical Islamism. HTS isn't really a government which you'd want to sort of speak to in the first, and plus Damascus isn't a very safe place at the moment, to be fair. However, there could potentially be HTS representatives in Beirut simply visiting, especially under the protection of this new pro-American Lebanese president that was only elected a few weeks ago. So that is to be kept in mind. And also, if Trump visits Beirut first, of course, it's one of the most destabilized countries in that particular Levant region over the last 40 years. It's seen an entirely tragic civil war. It's almost as if he's the new peacemaker, and he's brave enough to go into this, essentially to a zone which has been bombed by Israel so many, many hundreds of times over the last year. And he's willing to, of course, position himself as the bringer of a sort of new age, right? This Promethean peacemaker figure, which is very interesting. But again, just after visiting Beirut, hypothetically, if this peace deal between Hamas and Israel, of course, stands firm, there's a chance that he might just, for a very short time, visit Tel Aviv or Jerusalem as well, which I think for him, despite how unsafe it would be, I think for Trump, it would be a very powerful, it would be right up his alley in terms of his Zionism. It wouldn't surprise me as well. Maybe another visit to the West Wall as well, wearing a little kippah. That wouldn't necessarily harm his image amongst his Jewish Israeli friends. And it would show him as a very sort of eschatological figure, at least to evangelical Protestants as well. So not that I'm in favor of that. I'm just saying hypothetically, if it happens, it wouldn't surprise me. But speaking about the Houthis, of course, al-Houthi himself has stated openly that his group has carried out 1,255 military operations using ballistic missiles, drones, gunboats since November 2023. So you can imagine over 1,000 over the last more than a year. Intense. Now the Red Sea has become, almost a safe zone. But one of the big tanker owner companies, company name is Frontline, has said in an interview, says, "We are all hopeful with the ceasefire that it will bring peace to the Red Sea and to our business, but any ceasefire will be vulnerable to the risk of our crews being caught if the ceasefire is going to break." And again, the Houthis themselves have openly stated that our position regarding the situation in Gaza is linked to the position of our brothers in the Palestinian factions, and we will continue to monitor the stages of implementation of the ceasefire agreement in Gaza, and any Israeli violation, we will directly be ready to support militarily the Palestinian people if the ceasefire breaks. So just keeping that in mind, notice Netanyahu, of course, hypothetically, and of course people like Ben-Gvir, who looks like a complete demon and acts like one and speaks like one, if these people pressure somehow Netanyahu, and there are, by the way, anti-ceasefire protests, Conrad. So they're actually protesting against Netanyahu's decision to implement the ceasefire and against his government. There are also, again, still protests continuing against Netanyahu, which even took place before October 7th of 2023. So there's almost like three entirely opposing positions in Israel at the moment. There's, of course, the pro-Netanyahu group. There's, again, the anti-Netanyahu group, which criticizing him for not being liberal enough. And it's somewhat even unrelated to Hamas and the Gaza Strip. And now there's the anti-peace, probably hardcore Zionist, hardcore Israeli settlers who are protesting, the more Ben-Gvirian type folks who wish to, of course, essentially genocide the entire Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip, which is unfortunate. But generally speaking, this may be this Houthi ceasefire. I think the ceasefire, despite it bringing peace to these various regions, it does somewhat instill a certain concern and fear for the future. Where will the conflict break out next? Because we do know this is not the end, and there are concerns about some future war operations against Iran. And I think the Houthis should. It's not a time to relax with them right now, because we do know, even with Russia signaling building its embassy in the non-Houthi controlled city of Yemen, we do know Saudi Arabia, of course, bolstering itself, essentially inviting HTS members, positioning itself again as an ally of Israel and America. The Houthi story is not over yet. So just as they may not be throwing missiles at any passing by pro-Zionist Israeli ships in the Red Sea, I think we'll be hearing more about Ansar Allah and the Houthis in the coming future, most likely in 2025, especially if a conflict breaks out with Iran. Looking forward, Conrad, simply because the Houthis are mostly Shia and they're very, very closely aligned with Iran. I would say as much as, even more so than Dr. Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria was, and of course the Hezbollah, who are primarily Shia, that particular militia, which was stationed in Syria and again in Lebanon. So the ceasefire, it does bring a sort of air of concern as to where exactly the conflict will break out next and who will carry out the first strikes, or what kind of black swan events will force one of the sides to blame the other, similar to October 7th, right, which was almost entirely unexpected, and we're still actually not sure as to who orchestrated it, who planned it. Was it entirely a Hamas operation, or perhaps there were certain Mossad operatives behind it in order to provoke the reaction that resulted in over 200,000 Palestinian deaths? And what exactly will the future hold for Netanyahu himself? All these incredible questions, because Netanyahu has, not only does he have a warrant and legal proceedings in Israel, but also the International Criminal Court, of course, still has a warrant out for his arrest, as well as Ben-Gvir, who most likely Ben-Gvir loving Israel so much, he's such a hardcore Zionist, he'll never leave Israel in the first place. Whilst Netanyahu, he enjoys traveling around, he enjoys visiting Dachau and Auschwitz and all these other camps abroad, all these museums and whatnot, these playground parks. And so most likely he'd want to travel again. And so he'll have to maybe position himself as this peacemaker, pro-Trump figure that was misunderstood since October 7th, and that he'd want the warrants, of course, he'd want them to recede, and he'd want to play this role again of Israel being a civilized state. Because again, more than half of the world at the moment, especially the Muslim population of the world, views Israel right now with extreme hostility, despite the fact that most Sunni Muslim governments are extremely Shabbos goyish in their political outlooks and foreign policy. But we know the native civilian population feels very strongly for the Palestinians, who, again, at this point, a peace is very good because it'll mean a cessation of the death of innocent Palestinians. But however, perhaps there won't be an opportunity for vengeance. And we know in Islam, of course, revenge and vengeance is somewhat different to the Christian approach of forgiveness and moving on. So perhaps we'll see a further drive for some sort of retaliation into the future. And the question still is in the air as to what exactly Turkey will do in relation to Syria, in relation to Israel's occupation of Syrian land, and then what kind of role Turkey will play as it pushes further south, as it secures itself as this new sovereign over the Syrian heartland in the Middle East.
Now, we really discussed last episode the full extent of the supposed Turkish versus Israeli kind of clash that we're witnessing unfold. And we talked about how it's a bit of a bluff, how ultimately Turkey and Israel are much closer than any of these Iranian proxies or even many of these Russian-backed entities that exist in the Levant at the time. So again, while Israel's making noise and they don't like necessarily that HTS is in charge as opposed to some kind of liberal coalition or something bringing in the Kurds, they're definitely very, very happy about the fact that Assad is gone. And that's shown by the fact that they have been able to annex, a fairly substantial amount of new territory that they've occupied, which again, and the whole Druze thing, we talked all about that and how there's going to be this new big, we've been posting a lot of maps on our social media, for example, about how the future partition of Syria could really look. And before we bring Iran and Russia into the picture, I'm going to talk explicitly about that. So moving on to Syria, of course, the main fighting still is occurring between the SNA, the Syrian National Army, and the Syrian Defense Forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces. I always get them confused with the Sudanese and these other three-letter groups that we're talking about that are always fighting people. But the Syrian Democratic Forces, of course, which are allied with the Kurds, those are the main groups fighting right now for Turkey trying to fully exert its will up in northeastern Syria. But this is all around the Tishreen Dam, around the Euphrates River. And this is from U.S. News World Report. The PKK would leave Syria if Kurdish forces keep leadership role, officials say. It's from Reuters as well. An official with the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is the PKK terrorist group, they said on Thursday that the militant group would agree to leave northeastern Syria if the U.S.-allied Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces maintain a significant joint leadership role there. Any initiative resulting in the governance of northeastern Syria under the role of the SDF, or in which they have a significant role in joint leadership, will lead us to agree to leave the region, the official at the group's political office in northern Iraq said. And I've said before that, any kind of real Kurdish resistance to the Turks is going to have to be retreated well into Iraq. And Turkey had been talking about a special military operation into Iraq well before any of this latest Syria collapse happened. So that's not to say that that's off the table. But at this point, if this is real from the PKK, which it seems to be, and the Turks, are forced to grapple with it, I wouldn't be surprised if the Israelis really start to put their foot down, and go along with this and say, yes, we agree to this partition. And ultimately there will be a large area of northeastern Syria controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces. Most importantly, the very relevant oil fields in a lot of these Deir ez-Zor regions would be controlled by this American militia, which would make sure that Israel continued to get and steal Syria's natural resources uninterrupted, of course, because the Azeri and Turkish, supply, that's just not enough for the war machine they've got going in Gaza and Lebanon and elsewhere right now. They're a very, for their size, they use a lot of energy for how, hyper-capitalist and advanced they are compared to the rest of the Middle East. And I think that making sure that there's that U.S. presence in Syria is going to be critical for that. And of course, we're going to talk about the Turkstream gas pipeline issue, but before we get into that, obviously, I want to hear your thoughts, Dimitri, on the Russian-Iranian strategic cooperation, of course, that was signed. What was even more interesting as well was Putin's comment that Russian and Iranian interests align almost exactly, which I'm wondering what almost exactly means. I'm wondering if the asterisk is there for Israel or if it's there perhaps for Azerbaijan or something else, because we know that we've talked about how in many ways Iranian and Russian interests don't seem to align. Russia loves Azerbaijan and unfortunately Israel, whereas Iran is, very, very wary of, both of those two nations are kind of their number one enemies in many ways. Perhaps you had Saudi Arabia and some of their proxies in there as well. But this deal between Russia and Iran, it seems to be, comprehensive, military, economic, strategic in general, all of these sorts of things. So what really went on there, if you could tap us in?
Yeah, just a brief correction, Conrad. Of course, it's not Russia as like a country and the people who love Azerbaijan. It's the leadership of Russia, in particular President Putin, I think, has such a friendly relationship.
For some reason.
Look, without getting too conspirological, I think on the face of it, just scanning something like a Wikipedia, you can clearly tell Putin, people like Nikolai Patrushev, they have a very close relationship with Ilham Aliyev, and simply because of his father being the head of the KGB of the region. So this is more like a KGB career connection. Like these people have gone through the same sort of KGB brainwashing training operations and schooling. And by brainwashing, I mean this in the softest sense, because they do condition you to a very extreme extent in some of those FSB, KGB schools, to the point where, well, we won't go into details, but these people understand each other on a fundamental level. And of course, Putin meeting with Pezeshkian, right? This is probably the biggest event, I would say, in terms of Russia's response to the Trump inauguration. Because again, Putin hasn't noted any sort of agreements with Trump or any speaking with him behind the scenes or anything of that sort, right? Peskov has also stated, and Lavrov have confirmed over the last few weeks several times, that the US has not proposed any sort of peace agreements to Russia, and Russia is just looking out for its own interests. So Russia is not playing the doggy who has turned on its back and with its stomach up and is kind of afraid, waiting for the US to make an alpha move in this particular scenario. Russia, which I think is correct, because the Russian position on the front lines in the SMO right now are very strong. So there's no real reason for Russia to actually make huge concessions. And I say this with all due respect to even people like Pavel Gubaryov, who, as last week we stated, had some very strong comments to make about Russian, especially officer and leadership performance on the front lines of the SMO. But going back to Pezeshkian, the new president, very sort of center-right, maybe more centrist president of Iran, unlike the previous president. He's meeting with Putin and the agreement they signed. Of course, the agreement, first and foremost, was regarding Russian gas exports to Iran. We know Russia has a lot of gas at the moment, which, again, cannot be transferred through Ukraine because Ukraine has limited the gas pipeline export. We've discussed this last week, especially regarding the Gazprom lines, Soyuz and Brotherhood. These are really big concerns. So Russia has a lot of spare gas. And to whom could this gas be provided, and exactly by which pipeline, if Russia does construct the pipeline through the Caspian or maybe with the help of Azerbaijan into Iran, it again could perhaps secure some more sort of passive income for itself, so to speak, because gas is very, as we discussed with our good friend Gennady on the BRICS episode, once you build a pipeline, you just kind of ship gas off. You just turn it on, and there's no real, besides low-key maintenance, there's nothing really that goes into it. It's just, it kind of works on automation. As long as the money keeps coming in, the gas will keep flowing. So it's quite a simple sort of model looking into the future. But beyond that, of course, Putin also discussed the fact that Iran and Russia need to bypass these sort of terroristic sanctions that have been placed upon the two countries. And it's true, the two regimes, both in the Russian Federation and in the Iranian Republic, are under very strict sanction regimes. And it seems like Russia noticed it has kind of created this triumvirate between the three sort of so-called authoritarian reject countries, right, in terms of world international affairs that stand up against globalism: North Korea, Iran, Russia. They're kind of brought closer, despite having civilizational differences, simply by the fact that liberals have ousted them out of the international community, everything but the UN, of course. So that's quite warming, and that's actually what any logical politician would do. So there's nothing bad to say about Putin. Now, here comes the red pill, because this is the big talking point, is that this agreement wasn't just about energy or the export of goods or the trading of, say, Iranian drones to Russia so that it could send them at Ukraine and to secure sort of further victories for the Russian military operation. But it's the security agreement. So what's the difference between the Russian-Iranian and the Russian-North Korean security agreement? Well, when the agreement was signed with Kim Jong-un and the North Korean Republic, essentially the North Korean agreement is a more robust one. It essentially has something equivalent to the CSTO Article 4 or the NATO article, which essentially states that if a particular country attacks a member of this agreement, the other country must, again, come to its defense. We understand this. It's spoken about a lot in regards to NATO and exactly why Ukraine needs to be a part of NATO according to the globalist model of international relations and sort of co-defense. But in this particular case, Conrad, the agreement between Iran and Russia is a lot looser. Essentially, it's an agreement that states that if one of the countries is attacked, the other country must cease supporting the attacker, not come to the aid of the attacked partner. So in some ways, you can just kind of look at this and say, hold on. So, for example, if the US or Israel attack Iran, then Russia must cease supplying and cooperating and working with Israel and the US. That's all Russia can do according to this agreement in terms of, well, what are its obligations? And the same with Iran. But Russia is already not doing that much for Israel and, of course, the United States, even less for the US. But, of course, Russia still supplies Israel with various exports of grain, oil, gas, etc., right? And other goods from the Black Sea. So it's not as strong. And, of course, we have an example of one of these treaties of cooperation in the last 4 to 5 years going absolutely wrong. And that's, of course, the Commonwealth of Independent States Treaty, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the CSTO, which Armenia has officially in May of 2024 stopped funding, stopped contributing to. And in December of 2024, just before Christmas, Armenia officially stated that it's going to pull out of the CSTO because Armenia was not supported by Russia when it went to war with Azerbaijan. And, The origins of the conflict with Azerbaijan are still debated as to who attacked who first. Arguably, Armenia in Nagorno-Karabakh started the conflict first. That's what certain sides state. That's what certain pro-Azeri groups claim. But again, the fact is the CSTO did not work in the Armenia and Azerbaijan case. And so there's no guarantee that this particular treaty, which is very loose and very symbolic in its sort of defense capacities, Conrad, will be able to support Iran and even perhaps protect Iran from a future Israeli, US/Saudi Arabia coalition strike against it. That's all I want to say. And I'm not being super pessimistic here because, again, this is very good. An official treaty that has essentially moved the Overton window to a stronger Russo-Iranian relationship is very good in the first place because prior to this treaty being signed, there wasn't really any proper formal agreements in place between the two countries security-wise. But now there is. But I just want to take off the rose-colored glasses and just look at this in reality. Russia did not, of course, uphold the CSTO treaty with Armenia for whatever reason. Perhaps there were good reasons for it. So is there really a guarantee for the future of the Iran-Russian relationship if a massive regional war breaks out? Would Russia really stick its neck out for its Indo-European partner down there south of the Caspian Sea? So there's a lot to keep in mind here. And that's also considering the fact that Russia still has strong relationships with Israel. And despite even inviting members of Hamas to Moscow for diplomatic talks, Russia still hasn't broken any relations with Israel. And even with the fall of Syria, mind you, that was, I think, a big exclamation mark in viewing exactly how this new United Russia, Lavrov, Putin, Shoigu, Patrushev administration handles its foreign affairs. It's very unpredictable, I would say. So Iran really needs to be careful as to who it relies on and what the exact legalistic, and I'm sure these people are professional, politicians, they know exactly what the limits of this treaty are.
No, and they're very much aware of how surrounded they are with, the Turks, getting closer to their border in Syria, with the Balochistan whole thing going on in Iran and Pakistan on the border there. And of course, the Azeri menace, as we sometimes call it on the show, always at their north. So they obviously are very much looking to sign these sorts of treaties with their powerful allies like Russia. But the question still remains on the striking question, whether or not Iran will, quote unquote, respond to Israel for that dubious strike that we still don't know all the details of on some of its nuclear research facilities. If Israel and the U.S. are making further plans under the Trump administration to strike Iran or to foment, certain issues in Iran. Of course, recently this week, this was a big story. A former CIA official pleaded guilty to leaking top secret U.S. intelligence documents about the Israeli military's plans for a retaliatory strike on Iran. And we remember when, these plans were leaked. And it was, frankly, a big deal. And again, I'm not saying that it's a good thing that I'm not telling people to leak classified documents. I'm not making any judgment call. But the fact that this person did this prevented, in many ways, these strikes from even occurring. And of course, we know that the U.S. would have ultimately ended up having to back those strikes, at least rhetorically. And, this guy, he was a Muslim, of course. They're claiming, this is a problem with, Muslims in our intelligence agencies. And I mean, sure, this guy was loyal to his religion and his ethnicity, so no surprises there. But of course, the moment it's a Muslim, it's a whole big issue. But every single Jew in the State Department and the intelligence agency probably acting, of course, on behalf of the Zionist entity and world Jewry, they're never going to be put under this level of scrutiny. But I'm glad that these strikes didn't occur. And I'm glad that perhaps this new deal with Russia will also perhaps prevent certain strikes from happening. But with the Israelis in charge, I would not be surprised if that was not the case. But before we talk about the Turkstream issue, I just have some final news and everything from Syria. There was a big strike and a total destruction of this militia, this pro-Alawite independence militia near Latakia, the battalion of the Mountain Lions. They were led by a man, Bassem Hussein al-Din, who ended up posting a video taking out some HTS people, only to then immediately get airstriked and have his whole group basically taken out. And at one point, he was the most wanted man in Syria, but that seems to not be happening much more. There are still pockets of Assadist resistance and whatnot. And of course, there's the things going on with the Kurds, but ultimately HTS and their SNA allies and al-Jolani, the coalition that he's building, is triumphant. Of course, you mentioned that, the Russian foreign minister, the former ambassador to Israel, he's going to be visiting Syria very soon. And in general, it seems that the government is, despite the fact that they banned, for example, Iranians and Israeli citizens from flying to Syria, Turkish airlines now are going to have to restrict Iranian and Israelis from, entering. I doubt they'll will apply to Saudis, to Turks, of course, and to these other people. So it shows you that they're trying to present themselves as, see, we don't like Iran or Israel, but ultimately we know that the window did shift towards Israel if it had to go anywhere. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem that the Russians are even going to try to help create some kind of independent Latakian state, because I know that, HTS and Jolani, they're claiming they're committed to a united Syria. It seems that Israel is going to be the main advocate for something like that, no longer existing and the partition really going through. But we have to talk about this Turkstream issue. This is from TASS. Moscow has every reason to believe that a compressor station in southern Russia, which provides gas to the Turkstream pipeline, was attacked on a tip-off by the U.S. and the U.K. Russian Parliament representative to the United States, Vasily Nebenzia, said, "The January 11th attack on the Turkstream pipeline's compressor station in the Krasnodar region stands out in the series of attacks carried out by the Kiev regime. I would like to point out that shortly before that, the expired Ukrainian president had refused to extend a contract on the transit of gas to Europe through Ukraine. And we know right now that Transnistria, for example, has been experiencing extensive blackouts, and Russia has decided to provide them with oil just at a humanitarian basis and gas just so they can, keep their lights on and not even charge. Because, there was the whole dispute between Moldova and Gazprom and all these pipelines to Ukraine. And now Turkstream, which is being discussed here, is the primary avenue for, gas to flow into Europe. And we know that Erdogan is very interested in keeping that going. Some people have even posited that the US and the Ukrainians and the EU were going to fully take it out Nord Stream style, but that Erdogan put his foot down. And that's why what occurred was more of a message being sent as opposed to a full-on destruction of another key energy vector from Russia, towards the West, which, again, we know that those are the main things that the US is trying to destroy, so that all of Europe is not only subservient to them, but also just like incapable of rising up as any kind of power that could be relevant, the EU as an entire entity, which is very unfortunate. And that's why, of course, groups like the AfD in Germany are so popular. Somebody like Georgescu was going to win in Romania, and all these other places. Why Fico is in power in Slovakia is because Europeans are very much aware of this and realize that if they don't elect some of these new governments, they are going to be fully vassalized by the United States and have absolutely zero sovereignty, and very quickly start to see their quality of life dramatically lower. And I don't think anybody wants to see that, and the Russians are happy to do business. But the fact that the pipelines were flowing through Ukraine for this long as well showed how much Ukraine was just relying on this Western aid, because that would have been an amazing way for them to disrupt the Russian economy. But of course, that was not. The green light was not given to them by their handlers in Tel Aviv and DC. But before we start specifically talking about the war between Russia and Ukraine, I want to hear your thoughts on this Turkstream issue. We know that Orban is openly talking about how the EU needs to end all sanctions on Russia. Fico is talking about meeting with Zelensky to resolve a lot of these pipeline electricity exchange issues. And we know Vucic is involved in a lot of these pipeline talks as well. Turkey, Serbia, Hungary, a lot of this stuff is getting worked out. We know that Turkey has been talking about being a gas hub. I'm wondering your thoughts on, this whole situation and how it factors into Russia addressing the Turkish question, because, they're signing this deal with Iran, which in theory should make them aware of the Israel issue, but it also should be making them aware of the Turkish issue, which at this point, as Strelkov have said, if they're not aware of it by now, they're going to be walking into a disaster, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of Russians actually from the front lines, whenever they come on to give interviews, literally from Kursk or Kharkovskaya Oblast or Donetskaya Oblast, they're always mentioning the Erdogan neo-Ottoman project, when they start speaking about history and how Russia has fought Turkey in, many, many wars, over 10 wars, and so many other skirmishes and proxy wars throughout its long sort of history since it became a really independent Tsardom under, Tsar Ivan III and, of course, his grandson Ivan IV. So Russia has fought Turkey many countless times since, of course, the Turkish conquest of Constantinople. And I believe that history is far from over, and especially now we see that when, of course, Lavrov, the foreign minister of the Russian Federation, openly has accused the US and Ukraine of having this collaborative drone strike against the Turkstream, attempting to sabotage the entire gas pipeline, what we did see is that Turkey was ready to admit that, yes, there were enemy drones, from an unknown foreign entity attempting to strike the gas line, but it wasn't Ukraine. So Turkey is still trying to play this weird neutral game. And yes, it could be because literally Turkey as a part of NATO is in favor of Ukraine's independence, in favor of the Zelensky regime. That's number one. Number two is that, of course, Turkey literally received support from Ukraine in arming the Syrian National Army, arming HTS, and those stationed in the Idlib province. We do know that Ukrainian drones were involved in the taking of Aleppo, etc., all these battle front lines. Ukraine tried to get involved for the first time in its lengthy history. Well, actually not the first time, because there were Ukrainian commandos involved in Iraq and Afghanistan more than 20 years ago. But we do know that Ukraine was involved in the taking of Syria. So maybe Turkey is just trying not to anger its newly acquired Zelensky regime ally and even some of those really hardcore people in the Ukrainian government, and simply trying to balance, again, similar to Azerbaijan, trying to balance these considerations whilst it is still powering up, building its giant sort of East Mediterranean Sea neo-Ottoman navy, and again, trying to play this peacekeeper in the Balkans as well. So very important, but the other countries in the Balkans are also concerned because they're also recipients of the Turkstream gas. And so you have Bulgaria actually setting up security all over its territory. Anything that has to do with the gas pipelines going through Bulgaria, security is being set up there. And it just reminds me, Conrad, of the story from 2023, in which we saw like one of the most egregious terrorist attempts, of course, being stopped, a terrorist attempt by Ukraine, where they sent the truck all the way from Western Ukraine, through Moldova, through Romania, Bulgaria, and all across all of Turkey by land. The truck was never checked, all the way to the Georgian border. And in Georgia, the truck was seized by border security. They inspected it with dogs, sniffer dogs, and they found 42 or 43 kilograms of C4 explosives. So this truck traveled like 1,000 kilometers across the entire Black Sea coast through Turkish territory. And Turkey, by the way, has extremely, very, very good anti-terrorist implementations in terms of its internal security due to the Kurdish issue and all these other concerns. So Turkey actually has some pretty good systems in place at checking vehicles, checking for car bombs. Unfortunately, a lot of Islamic countries in general have had extremists blow things up, all around, including in Southeast Asia, of course, all around India, Pakistan, etc. But Bangladesh, we see this all the time. So the Turks have been building up this capacity to handle these terrorist acts, and yet they did not spot this massive truck with enough explosives to blow up an entire city block. Like that is, I don't want to say nuclear explosive, but 42 kilos of C4. And this was in 2023 when this truck was stopped. And this could have caused most likely the entire Kerch Bridge to blow up if they managed to get this truck up there. It would have killed thousands of people potentially. So the real concerns for Turkish security are very linked to this Russo-Ukrainian conflict. And just like I do respect the Turkish attempts to regain their sovereignty and regain what was lost after the First World War and the revolution of Ataturk. But generally speaking, they really should push away from this interdependence with NATO and Ukraine because it really isn't doing them any favors. Greece is powering up its air force. From a Turkish perspective, NATO is only weakening them. And yes, they do have some Turkish bases with up to, I believe, 50 nuclear missiles stationed on their territory. But as we saw in Russia's case, nuclear deterrence and nuclear defense really doesn't stop a particular militant group or terrorist strikes against your territory or even a capturing of an entire sector of an oblast or a province, just like we can see in Kursk. Like just having the missiles themselves is not going to save your nation's sovereignty, hypothetically. So there's a lot of consideration to go here. But the Turks at the moment, this week at least, not admitting that Ukraine was behind the drone strike when very clearly Ukraine was the agent of sending these long-range drones. Somehow they've managed to get their hands on this drone technology similar to the drones that flew from Iran to Israel, Conrad, that can fly hundreds and potentially thousands of kilometers, like distant, remote, controlled, and they can actually cause havoc just essentially across a very lengthy distance, as we've seen in the Leningrad Oblast just outside of St. Petersburg, in the Tverskaya Oblast, the explosive just northwest of Moscow when they blew up that huge arms depot in 2024, probably one of the craziest explosive footages we've ever seen, I think, in the 21st century. All of this is possible because the Ukrainian leadership is simply very reckless in terms of the military operations it chooses to conduct. And again, the SBU, the Ukrainian military intelligence, is almost terroristic and almost very ISIS-like in the way they conduct themselves. And it's just about time a lot of these countries admitted that and stopped cooperating with them. But again, it's all wishful thinking, right? And the Turks, they have very long-term plans. They're not willing to throw away that Ukrainian potential ally card because Ukraine is the battering ram. It is the key to potentially weakening Russia and weakening the United Russia Putin regime, which is currently in place. And Turkey could be one of the beneficiaries of a collapsing Russian Federation, especially in the Northern Caucasus, especially with this rising Islamism, the mass immigration from Central Asia, mostly of Turkic peoples. There's a lot up for grabs with Turkey. So patience is a virtue in the case of Erdogan and in the case of this neo-Ottoman project. They just need to keep their cool, ignore any ridiculous, almost borderline retarded acts by Ukraine, and simply wait until Ukraine gets the upper hand, which, technically speaking, it's not going to happen at the moment, but who knows, based on Zelensky's actions and based on the support that Trump may potentially give to Ukraine into the future, despite the fact that he said that he'll bring peace, but we know Trump can be somewhat two-faced in the way he approaches foreign policy. So the Turkish aspect of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, I think, has been always a massive factor since the Ankara peace talks, which were unsuccessful. And I think they'll continue to be this joker in the deck of cards of world affairs.
Well, and it's worse than just the Turks not blaming the Ukrainians for the strike. What are the odds that it was a Turkish drone? I mean, who gave Ukraine all of its drones at the beginning of the war? It was the Bayraktar drones. Of course, now they're giving them all to Morocco and all these other groups that now saw their success, just like Iran was providing their, Shahed and these others to Russia. And these two, in many ways, on the battlefield, the Turks and the Iranians were throwing each other's weapons at each other through the proxies of the Ukrainians and Russians. But the situation, of course, in Ukraine is, I wouldn't say it's escalating necessarily. We're not seeing a dramatic increase in casualties as the Russians advance. But as Trump, prepares for his inauguration, there seems to be this bit of a diluted calm. As Russia, they do take more and more areas in the Donetsk Oblast. The question now becomes, what will Trump ask the Ukrainians to initially do? And unfortunately, we have from Mike Waltz, Trump's new national security advisor is now advocating publicly that Ukraine lower its draft age to 18. And right now, of course, the draft age in Ukraine is 26. So this would be very dramatic. This would be bringing all of the young people, towards the front lines. And this is one of the most kosher Talmudic things I think Trump could be doing. I mean, for those of you that, we've talked about New Heavenly Jerusalem in the past, of course, in Ether Hour. And there's been the ongoing thesis that ultimately the Jewish elites behind the West in Ukraine, as well as the Jewish elites that still exist in Russia, are ultimately just genociding the white Slavic population that, in Russia as well as in Ukraine, depopulate this region in many ways just for the heck of it, but possibly also for the creation of a new heavenly Jerusalem, which is this idea of this sort of new Khazarian state as this backup for if, the Zionist entity in the Levant fails and falls to its 80-year curse, like many people predict that it will. But I want to hear, of course, your full breakdown of the frontline situation in Ukraine, Dimitri, but we are hearing from Keir Starmer, for example. This is from Politico. He has signaled that he would be ready to consider sending British forces to Ukraine to help guarantee the peace when the war eventually comes to a halt. Britain will, quote, play our part in supporting the peace when it eventually comes, Starmer told reporters when asked about the idea after holding talks with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev on Thursday. Asked about post-war peacekeeping, Starmer said, "Let me be very clear to everybody here in Ukraine when I say we will work with you and all of our allies on steps that would be robust enough to guarantee Ukraine's security, to guarantee any possible peace and deter any future aggression." He added, "Peace through strength must be more than words. It's got to be actions. Therefore, as I say, we will play our part when it comes to guaranteeing Ukraine's security." So we're seeing more and more maps of, the current territories plus the rest of the areas east of the Dnieper is a demilitarized zone, and then the rest is this rump state. And again, we don't know exactly how that's going to fan out. I'm sure Trump will be trying to meet with Putin in the first few months of his presidency, but whether or not a ceasefire, let alone any kind of comprehensive negotiations, actually unfold is very much yet to be seen. And I think we had, the U.S. and the Ukrainians and Russians projecting that 2025 would be this sort of terminal year. But as far as I can tell, it looks like the can has been kicked a little bit down the road. But before I throw it back to you, Dimitri, I just want to add this one really quick story, and it's about Biden's new sanctions on Russia and China. This is from the Libertarian Institute. Over the past few weeks, the U.S. has issued new sanctions on Russia and China. The Biden administration has attempted to cripple the Russian economy in response to the invasion of Ukraine. Beijing has responded to the economic war on China with retaliatory sanctions on American firms. On Wednesday, the Treasury Department issued new sanctions on 15 firms and redesignated about 100 companies doing business with the Russian Ministry of Defense, as well as blacklisting Russian companies, and a myriad of Chinese firms, including Karamet Bank in Kyrgyzstan, were also sanctioned. And last week, fresh sanctions were also issued against the Russian energy sector. The move is aimed at hemming in incoming President Donald Trump's policy on the Ukraine war. Of course, Biden is kind of doing all sorts of things here at the last minute. I'm going to briefly mention the ERA thing later in the episode. But Washington also added major Chinese companies, Tencent Holdings, battery maker CATL, state oil firm CNOOC, and shipping line Costco to the blacklists. And while the blacklists are not exactly sanctions, it marks the companies as having ties with the Chinese military, which Americans are deterred from trading with. And finally, Beijing responded to Washington's economic war and other provocations with further sanctions. In December, China sanctioned several Western arms firms over weapons shipments to Taiwan. Under President Biden, the White House began sending Taipei weapons, paid for with military assistance. Additionally, in January, China placed trade controls on another 28 American firms, and Beijing set a blacklist of these companies to safeguard national security and interests. So, Taiwan is being brought into this trade war and this arms war. Of course, I think the U.S. sends a lot of weapons to Taiwan to show China, what they can do to prevent them from further perhaps funding the war effort in Ukraine. I think they want to keep it to Iran and North Korea and not get China involved there. But Dmitry, what is going on in Ukraine? How close are we to seeing troops, perhaps in Pokrovsk? And I've also seen some of these videos. I mean, we saw Zelensky post supposedly the first interviews with captured North Korean soldiers. I'm wondering your thoughts on all of that and how things are unfolding on the front right now.
Yeah, it's like one of those reports because during the First World War, Japan actually, surprisingly, given the fact that the Russo-Japanese War took place 10 years prior, Japan actually came out on Russia's side and it actually allied with the Entente against the central regimes. And when the Buryat and various other Cossacks were arriving from the Far East to the front lines of the First World War, a lot of the Russians were seeing these Far East, essentially Asian-looking people, and they were very happy. They're like, wow, the Japanese are here to support us, but these are not Japanese. These are Far East Asians who are, citizens of the Russian Empire. But this is exactly what's happening right now. There was a lot of video footage, a lot of photographs of essentially Buryat, all kinds of other peoples from Far East, Siberia, near the Lake Baikal and, Vladivostok, all those regions. Essentially, people.
I mean, I'm sure a lot of our listeners saw the video, which to me is still the craziest footage I've seen from the war of that Tuvan soldier having that knife fight with the Ukrainian and, somehow surviving after they both, stab each other a dozen times and the knife exchanged hands. It was literally like something out of The Revenant. It was one of the craziest things. And the guy
absolutely savage.
Could have been Korean, could have been a Han, but he was just full on Tuvan.
Absolutely. I mean, that entire exchange, it's just as gruesome as the interview in which afterwards he kind of described what happened off camera, where it kind of paints the entire conflict in a more negative light, so to speak, because he stated that he walked away from the injured Ukrainian soldier and then he came back to see the Ukrainian soldier was still breathing. So he took a grenade, tried to blow the Ukrainian soldier up and also shot him a couple of times. And it just... unnecessary details, I think, kind of take away from the heroism, make it look like, but again, war is war on the front lines. It's, you do have to make sure that your enemy is actually, being killed. Otherwise, he may call in for reinforcements or who knows what exactly. That Tuvan soldier, by the way, was very far deep behind enemy lines. He wasn't supposed to survive. Apparently, his commander sent him and his comrade deep into a Ukrainian village in order to put up a Russian flag to allegedly claim that the village was captured. And so he traveled literally far away and he had a confrontation and, of course, the knife fight itself, which I think we all saw quite, I think, epic. And it does show, like, exactly how savage war can be in hand-to-hand sort of cold steel conflict, even on the front lines. But, yeah, the majority of the fighting at the moment is taking place along the Kurskaya Oblast and, again, next door, again, in the Kharkovskaya Oblast. The Russians actually have reported through their defense minister, Belousov. He's released a statement which states that the Russian troops are advancing in all directions in the Kursk Oblast. The opponent is losing ground and retreating from previously held positions despite additional reinforcements. According to the report, 63.2% or 801 square kilometers of the Kursk region's territory, which was originally occupied by Ukraine, has now been reclaimed. Interesting, these sort of almost collective conclusion statements are being made, almost as if they're targeted. Like the Russians already know this, but this is a statement not so much, I think, for the Russian citizens themselves, but to maybe even the new Pete Hegseth, perhaps, like the new Minister of Defense of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, or even people in the new Trump administration, almost as if Belarus is saying, look, actually the US has less leverage on Ukraine and the Ukrainians have less leverage on Russia than you may think. Here's what actually is taking place. Don't listen to Syrski, don't listen to Zelensky, right? So this is like massive international signaling taking place, which I do agree with Belarus. Russia has taken back a very big chunk. You can see it on literally all the map analyses, and even Ukrainians are admitting that Russia has taken back a very large percentage of the Kursk Oblast, which is quite good because, again, this only means that the Kursk civilians can suddenly just return from the refugee camps, go back to their farms, their villages and homes, and begin rebuilding after what has taken place, essentially a hostile takeover. But in the Kursk Oblast, it still seems that this will meet this Trump inauguration with an occupation of Sudzha and an occupation of tens more of Russian villages, which again may play into Ukrainian favor when, of course, they discuss peace talks with Trump and exactly what their proposals will be on a potential compromise with Russia. Maybe a trading of, again, those Kursk lands for certain Ukrainian control over the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant or Energodar on the other side of the Dnieper River, hypothetically. So a lot of considerations to take place there. But of course, the big news is that Taretsk hypothetically, the Russians are almost claiming that it has fallen this week officially. Taretsk is, again, a population of 33 to 40,000 people. It looks like a desolated wasteland at the moment, almost Bakhmut-like, completely destroyed. Both sides have been fighting for it very intensely over the last 6+ months. And finally, I believe the Russians are almost entirely surrounding it. It's going to fall very, very soon. And they're going to announce it this week, but both Taretsk and Chasiv Yar are basically on the verge of, again, being captured by Russia. But mind you, these two are not massive cities. It's not a Kharkov, it's not a Dnipro, it's not a Zaporozhye. These cities are just the size, as I said, 30 to 40,000 people at most, right, at their peak capacity. At the moment, they're, of course, completely depopulated. And the big battles that will be taking place in the near future and that essentially are approaching us is the Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk, a city of roughly 60,000 people in terms of size. Ukraine has already reported that 50,000 have left, and so there's about 10 to 11,000 people remaining in Pokrovsk. Many Orthodox churches, monasteries there, but Pokrovsk, the Russians have secured a major highway leading into the city, essentially trying to limit any Ukrainian maneuvering going into the Pokrovsk city. The Russians essentially, according to Ukrainian news, and again, Russians are also reporting on the fact that if they could surround Pokrovsk, it will definitely fall a lot sooner than, say, a Bakhmut and Avdiivka or some of these other cities, which essentially the Russians are using very old school basic siege tactics where it's just front head-on siegecraft as opposed to surround tactics, which we saw during the Second World War. Of course, the classical surround the city and take it within 1 to 2 weeks as opposed to several months of frontline, hard-headed, jar-headed battle, which exhausts both sides and leads to tens of thousands of dead soldiers, unfortunately, which Putin himself said that the Ukrainian soldiers are essentially just Russians but brainwashed. So again, even the deaths of thousands of Ukrainians is in the long term going to be a demographic tragedy in this particular case. But Ukraine also blows up a major mine shaft leading up to Pokrovsk, or just on the outskirts of the city, already anticipating a massive Russian push forward. And we have to keep in mind that just like in the taking of Bakhmut, on the outskirts of Bakhmut, you had all those underground like dungeons and massive mines like you had in Soledar, the salt mines and coal mines and all these other underground Soviet-style basements, right, essentially made for miners for the storage of goods that would later be exported to the world economy and inside the Soviet Union itself. So is here as well in Pokrovsk. There are these massive mine shafts, and the Ukrainians are blowing up the entrances to the mine shafts because they're anticipating that the Russians will use these underground passageways to outflank the enemy. So it's quite interesting. The battles of Pokrovsk will be essentially three-dimensional, Conrad, in the air with drones, warplanes, helicopters on the ground, and under the ground as well. So most likely this conflict will commence, I would say, probably before February this year. So we'll definitely be seeing a professional, in the style of the SMO, classical siege of Pokrovsk. I have my doubts about how exactly Russia will surround Pokrovsk. There are some rumors that Russia may be using WWN, professional airborne commandos, to again make a proper surround with the Pokrovsk city, but we haven't really seen the WWN active anywhere besides Sudzha recently. But there are questions as to where exactly General Teplinsky is. Teplinsky was made head of the VDV airborne commandos in June, July of 2022, shortly after the failure and I would say tragedy at Gostomel outside of Kiev. And Teplinsky, just for reference, he's essentially that sort of handsome, really good-looking soldier general that was made essentially the commander of the airborne commandos in 2022. But what's curious about him is that he's very favored amongst the Russian leadership. He's a very skilled professional, of course, in his own right. He hasn't made any massive blunders during the SMO, and now he's been essentially missing for at least the last year. He's been in some, you could see him during some parades and some ceremonies, but him as well as a large force of the VDV airborne commandos have been hypothetically, and the reason I'm saying this is because some of the interviews coming out from the front lines are actually anticipating Teplinsky as well as his commandos appearing somewhere in the front lines because they've been essentially out of action. Where will they appear? Apparently they've been stationed in Kherson or Zaporozhye somewhere, but will we see massive airdrops by Russia just like in those battles of the 20th century? As ineffective as they may have been, at least they look very cool. And you have these special operations troops dropping down with parachutes. It looks very, like a classical warfare type battle. So Teplinsky may again appear somewhere in the battlefield. And we know he's Kadyrov's favorite Russian general. Kadyrov admitted this again in some of his Instagram posts. So that's always quite entertaining. Of course, Kadyrov's commentary is much needed, no pun intended. But again, so now as the front line kind of stabilizes and Russia takes to some of these cities, already it's well anticipated. Ukraine is moving in some of its strongest commandos. These are, again, the Azov battalion have made an appearance in Toretsk, just as the Ukrainians are almost just exactly like in Avdiivka, Conrad, where we saw the Azov battalion, these hardcore Banderite neo-Nazis come into Avdiivka as the main Ukrainian forces were leaving and they were kind of supporting their exit. So in Toretsk, we see Azov finally arrive in order to, I suppose, assist the wounded and sort of remaining Ukrainian troops leave that particular city. Azov, again, are claiming some outrageous numbers of killed Russians. They're stating that they kill up to 100 Russians a day, that they've surrounded and taken tens of Russian hostages and prisoners. But again, this is very questionable information coming from the Ukrainian media and the Ukrainian Minister of Internal Affairs and all these other key figures. So all that's kind of up in the air at the moment. But the Russian front line is more or less has been stagnant, I would say. As we mentioned in 2024, there's been not much progress after the taking of Avdiivka. And more or less, we're speaking about essentially just Kursk, the major battles around the Sumskaya, Chernigovskaya Oblast, and that potential hypothetical counteroffensive which Ukraine is preparing somewhere up there in those northern oblasts and regions. Could Ukraine strike at Bryansk, Belgorod? Could they strike out of the Chernigovskaya Oblast or the Sumskaya Oblast? Where exactly is Zelensky planning his next move? Or is he only saving that next move for after the peace talks with Russia fail after the inauguration? That's one scenario. The second scenario is that Zelensky will make a drastic, like a rapid strike, capture as much territory as possible just before the inauguration. I know this is a stretch, but we know that if Ukraine controls a large portion of Russian land, Zelensky and his regime will have more leverage over the coming peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, with, again, the US playing this middleman mediator. So there's a lot to consider here. But generally speaking, at the moment, Russia is looking very good. I would say Russia going into the inauguration of President Trump and the hypothetical peace talks in the near future will be coming in with a very strong and obvious advantage for itself. And looking forward, I would say there's no real need to despair. And again, the SMO hasn't been perfect and we are approaching the third year. But generally speaking, Ukraine is looking much worse. And again, all of Ukraine's allies in NATO and the EU are complaining both about the military losses and the economic energy crisis that they're currently suffering from.
No, I completely agree. And you can get the sense of kind of desperation that they're experiencing from this Politico piece. It says Donald Trump in the White House doesn't have to mean a collapse of the effort to defeat Russia in Ukraine, the Polish and Ukrainian leaders said on Wednesday in the Polish capital. So Zelensky was meeting with Donald Tusk. Mm-hmm. He said, "We expect active joint work in the spirit of peace through strength with the newly elected U.S. President Trump." Zelensky said this. And it was part of a broader summit to firm up the strategic partnership between the two key allies, Ukraine and Poland, that aims to fully end long-running tensions, they talked about World War II stuff. And the immediate issue they discussed was Trump, which again, I think you mentioned the sort of slowing down of the front lines, especially outside of the Kursk region. I think that is largely because even the Russians, as much as they may not want to admit it, are very much watching what Trump is going to do. Of course, we said Trump had said he was going to end the war before he got inaugurated. Then he said he was going to end it within 24 hours. So people are nervous that some people think that he's going to give up a lot of territory on day one. I really don't think that's going to happen. Trump famously said he would end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours. This is from the Politico piece, leading worries that he would force Kiev into an unfavorable peace deal. However, in recent days, Trump's advisors have suggested any ceasefire might still be months away. And of course, that's coupled with Mike Waltz talking about lowering the conscription age to 18. So if Trump was intending to end this thing day one, they definitely would not be openly discussing that. So I appreciate the analysis, Dimitri. It's some good frontline updates. And before we transition to fully talking about what's going on in America, we got to discuss a few other electoral things coming up. Of course, Romania. This is from Yahoo News. Romania's coalition government approved on Thursday a rerun of a 2-round presidential election on May 4th and May 18th of 2025, as previously agreed, and tightened campaign rules for big social media platforms, including TikTok. And there's rumors that they're just going to completely box Georgescu out from running, which I don't know if they're going to physically be able to do that. And we've seen more and more protests in Romania getting up to 30, 40, 50,000 people in the streets protesting against the just ridiculous election interference. We, of course, talked about Terry Britton in the past openly saying how if the AfD wins in Germany, the EU is going to do exactly what they did in Romania and basically nullify the elections. And in Germany, we're seeing big protests against, the AfD had their opening yearly event where they're kind of kicking things off, getting ready for the February 23rd elections there. And we had huge Antifa presence, huge, Zog-backed protests there against the Alternative for Germany, who are opposed to potentially win in a very, very big electoral victory, the first truly right-wing government to be elected in Germany since, we all know what happened back then, right? So it would be a very big development to say the least, and we are rooting for them. But moving on, of course, the Trump inauguration is the biggest sort of electoral fallout situation that we are all waiting for at bated breath, waiting to see, what executive orders he's going to do on that first day. We're all watching these people, Hegseth, Marco Rubio, get through their Senate confirmations. Hegseth, of course, people called him a Zionist. He started getting longhoused by all these women because he's, not as in favor of all this tranny woke stuff in the military. And he even said that they were going to apologize and give back pay to all service members that had been kicked out for not getting the COVID vaccine. So that was one of the good things we saw from all of these hearings. But unfortunately, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, fourth in line for the presidency, he was saying some insane stuff. He said that, for example, that they were going to lift sanctions on Jews living in Judea and Samaria and other settler areas. So fully embracing Greater Israel, the settlers in all of these regions. And the exact quote he also said was, Trump's administration will be the most pro-Israel administration in American history. So we know what we're getting in the foreign policy department. We know Hegseth is a rabid Zionist. So as far as the foreign policy front, the Israelis really have this one locked down. Again, the Ukraine stuff's going to be a bit more of a wild card. And we're witnessing all the Greenland stuff. I'll talk about that in a second. But before I discuss that, the big thing coming up that's going to happen before Trump's inauguration, unfortunately, is this TikTok ban. And the Supreme Court actually rejected a challenge to the TikTok ban, which I thought is ridiculous. I frankly thought the Supreme Court was going to realize that it was nonsense. But this is from Kyle Anzalone. Yeah. It says the Supreme Court of the United States ruled unanimously that banning TikTok does not violate the First Amendment.
Wow.
The popular app could face a ban in the United States as early as Sunday. In his final days in office, President Joe Biden is working to prevent the ban from taking place. I don't know how much he's actually doing that. Trump, I've heard, is also trying to do the same thing. We've heard people like Mr. Beast, the people that own Kick Streaming, they want to buy TikTok. Of course, I don't know how any of that would work. We've heard all the people going over to, Red Note or whatever the other Chinese thing is called, and now it's already getting censored. So this is a big deal. We have a quote here. All 9 SCOTUS justices agreed with the opinion. We conclude that the challenged provisions do not violate the petitioner's First Amendment rights. The decision is a blow to TikTok that was arguing banning the platform was a violation of freedom of speech, which I agree that it is. I mean, it's only getting banned because people were exposing Israel on it. But following the ruling, Congressman Thomas Massie explained that banning TikTok is censorship. When TikTok goes dark, please remember I voted against the so-called TikTok ban because the legislation was overly broad and sets a dangerous precedent for censorship. Senator Rand Paul concurred, explaining millions of Americans express themselves on TikTok on a daily basis, and it's just wrong for the government to ban it. 170 million Americans use TikTok. So it really is crazy. We know that this is about Israel and ultimately about Silicon Valley being unable to compete with ByteDance and all these other Chinese companies. The companies that we talked about earlier in the sanctions part that Biden is sanctioning, this is all ties together because China is really outcompeting us on a lot of tech fronts. We know that China is outcompeting us, for example, in the electric car market. That's why Javier Milei had to be installed in Argentina to get Elon Musk and these Western electric car producers enough lithium to compete against the Chinese who are just cranking these things out. And that's more than what this is. It's, a hybrid piece of legislation against both China and in favor of Israel, which is a surprise to nobody. But we'll see if Trump does anything about this. If he, somehow managed to reverse this in his presidency, that would win him a lot of support from the youth. And again, I'm not on TikTok all the time, but it obviously shouldn't be banned. It's ridiculous. And this comes as Trump has apparently had some very positive phone calls with Xi Jinping, and I frankly doubt they talked that much about TikTok. Well, actually, it says right here that we discussed balancing trade, fentanyl, TikTok, and many other subjects. So perhaps Trump did bring that up, and maybe he's going to be saving TikTok for the rest of us. But the other big story that we got to talk about in the United States is Elon's latest Starship. I believe it was Starship 7, or what it was called, launched from the Star Base in southern Texas. And unfortunately, it exploded upon re-entry into the atmosphere and rained this beautiful constellation of debris down over my former home country, the Turks and Caicos Islands, which the videos from there are very crazy. And there's people that saw it that had no idea that there was even a spaceship up there, and people thought all sorts of crazy things were happening. And, who knows, maybe this was something symbolic, a sign of the times in the sky and whatnot. Turks and Caicos, maybe there's something symbolic with Turkey. I'm getting a little schizophrenic at this point, but I thought that was wonderful and perhaps a symbolic of Elon. At this point, we've kind of expressed how we no longer want Elon's influence over Trump because all he wants to do is bring in 1 million Indians and do a bunch of other nonsense. So perhaps this is a sign that Elon's star is waning and that he isn't going to be as successful perhaps in this administration as Trump and some of these other goals. We're hearing about the potential mass deportations that are going to be happening on day one, which again, I am not holding my breath. And if you think that a 200 officer deportation operation in Chicago is equivalent to quote unquote mass deportations, I have a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you. But that's not to say I'm not going to rejoice in seeing these deportations happen regardless, because look, any deportation is a good deportation, and we certainly need more of those. But before I hand it back to you, Dimitri, Biden and Kamala Harris, they tried to push this through, the Equal Rights Amendment, which is a total piece of communist nonsense. It's, basically fully integrating the civil rights regime into the Constitution of the United States. And I believe back in the 80s, people had tried to push this forward, and to add an amendment to the Constitution, you need the approval of 38 states. And so this is a bit of the background. The 1970s era amendment passed by Congress would guarantee men and women equal rights under the law, but it took until 2020 for enough state legislatures to ratify it, missing a deadline set by Congress by a long shot. The deadline was 1982. ERA proponents have argued that the deadline was not binding because it was in the preamble to the amendment rather than the text of the amendment itself. On Friday, Biden said he believed the ERA had cleared the hurdle to be added to the Constitution as its 28th Amendment when Virginia ratified it 5 years ago. He did not explain why he waited until the waning days of his presidency to take action, though he said he had consulted dozens of constitutional scholars as he weighed his decision. The only reason he did this is to give the Democratic Party some sort of pro-abortion victory, because obviously nobody's going to accept this amendment. It's going to get thrown out. But he can say, see, we tried to protect women and from this anti-abortion stuff, because it would basically make all abortion legislation by these states that have banned it, like in Texas and Idaho, would make those legislations invalid, as well as a number of other issues. So that's what they're attempting to do, and it's going to totally fail. And the fact that they, waited so long to do this, despite claiming that it had been in effect 5 years ago before he was even president, proves that this is just a stupid, naked political ploy. But one of the other things that was going on was, we've heard more talk about the Greenland-Panama Canal situation, and Trump actually wants to establish a United States sovereign wealth fund, get $110 billion from Wall Street and BlackRock, and then use that money in the wealth fund to develop Greenland and the area around the Panama Canal, which, that's just a full-on Zog plan right there. Listen to our episode with Anthony of Westgate, where we talk about how Trump and Elon and a lot of these characters are going to be kind of these Trojan horses to get nationalists and conservatives to accept, Club of Rome, Morgenthau, globalist style, North American Union type plans. And now we have open discussions about BlackRock being the main developers in these newly annexed United States territories, which is just crazy. But, I could keep yapping about some of these stories, but I want to hear your thoughts, Dimitri. Trump's inauguration is apparently going to be moved inside on January 20th because of how cold it's going to be. The first time that's happened since President Ronald Reagan's second inauguration. So a bit interesting.
No, absolutely. I am more skeptical about the involvement of the US in the Panama Canal, in Central American relations, especially keeping in mind the control that certain clans, as we mentioned with our show on it, with Anthony on Eighth Hour, how we had those, especially these particular Jewish Semitic elites, of course, still controlling many of those Central American, South American nations. So it's not exactly straightforward benefits for the American people. It's not just the big corporations, it's also the local elites benefiting from these various programs, which the Trump administration will apparently implement for the strength and sovereignty of America. When we understand that what America needs is actually internal reform first and foremost, beyond, of course, playing empire in South America or even up north in libtard Canada or even with Greenland. But the really funny news, and this shows you just how much of a theater perhaps the entire Greenland situation is in some capacity, because the Greenland government has actually sent several F-35, so these are fifth generation stealth fighters, which were produced by Lockheed Martin, by the way, of course, to their Jutland base in Greenland in order to protect the sovereignty of the island. And again, it's not stated against whom. Well, it's suspected against the United States. But the funniest part was, of course, that a few of those planes actually took off from the United States itself, from the base in which they were receiving maintenance, to fly to Greenland to, again, defend Greenland from an incursion from the United. It's a theater play essentially. At the moment, that's what we can see. Right? It's like they might as well have a tracking device on them, literally like a GPS tracker on the plane as it takes off from an American base, flying to Greenland to defend against the American Air Force. It's hilarious. But what's even more curious is the fact that the Prime Minister of Denmark actually has openly stated that she's willing to. And this is, of course, Fredriksen. She's a woman. She stated that she's openly willing to discuss the fate of Greenland with Donald Trump. Again, we understand that Denmark is a monarchy, but again, because it's parliamentarian, constitutional, therefore the monarch, the king of Denmark, doesn't really have that much power altogether. So you literally have female politicians, like liberal elected, those who believe in democracy, European LGBTQ rights. These people are making decisions about the sovereignty of certain land masses. I mean, this is as crazy as you can get. This is the peak liberalism, peak post-Enlightenment, postmodernism. And of course, we're not sure exactly where the entire Greenland story will go or if it's a massive distraction, but at least we know who is taking it seriously. And perhaps this is in jest, but the Bosnian leader, Dodik, actually openly stated that he actually supports Trump's remarks about Greenland, and he says that Serbia should have access to Republika Srpska and Kosovo because Trump should have access to Greenland, and he says it's completely logical and it makes entirely, a lot of sense.
I agree, Dodik.
Well, and I've heard Russian commentators say the same thing. They've stated, well, the people of Crimea had a referendum and we annexed, we didn't really annex, but we just joined Crimea to Russia in 2014. We had a referendum. The people of Greenland should also have the same. Why are Americans and the people of Denmark being hypocrites? They should allow the people of Greenland to decide which sovereign state they should be part of via referendum. Again, it's this hyper-democratization. Again, not that we believe that referendum should decide the fate of nations or geography or sovereign states, but it is, like, generally speaking, I think it's just very interesting what kind of precedents the joining of Greenland could create. And if Trump succeeds, of course, we're not going to go too much into depth, but he could definitely paint himself as one of the greatest American presidents, I think, in the history of the United States, which would be quite interesting. Like, he'll always be remembered in the history books, even 100, 200 years into the future, if, of course, the world lasts that long, given certain trends in recent history. But the other bit of news, while we're still in the Americas, Conrad, is, of course, the tensions on the Venezuela-Colombian border. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with South American geography, these are very small nations that may even be inconsequential to those living outside of America, is, of course, the gangs in Colombia. Those who remember a famous Colombian cocaine trade that took place, essentially the country in the 80s was essentially entirely run by drug cartels. And now, of course, that Colombia has regained a certain semblance of sovereignty in cooperation with the United States and other regimes surrounding it. It has begun to fight these gangs. And over the last few years, despite us not covering it, there have been sort of gang wars in the jungles of Colombia, which is right next door to Venezuela, on the opposite side of Guyana and Essequibo, which we covered quite recently. So there are tensions and there are firefights taking place in the jungles. The president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, has officially announced that he will suspend all peace talks with this new gang of rebels that are trying to fight against his regime. This is the National Liberation Army, the ELN, who are fighting against the legitimate government of Colombia, at least according to the electorate. And so Colombia, once again, we have another country right next door to Venezuela, just like in Guyana and Essequibo, a country which is experiencing Sudan/Syria type tensions and very similar to Myanmar. It's almost like these various countries which are on the border of these big regimes like the United States, Iran, Russia, China, India are all experiencing certain tensions, and every nation seems to have a hyper-liberal democratic liberation rebellion force, right? And it's very curious as to who controls these ELN rebels in Colombia. So this news will probably keep developing as the suspension of the talks has just taken place a few days ago. So again, how long will Colombia stand and sort of hold itself up regarding any pressures? And we know that Maduro as well and his regime in Venezuela, only recently there's been, of course, the warrant out for his arrest in the United States. There's essentially a bounty on his head for 25 million.
Mm-hmm.
And if I was Maduro, just thinking out loud here, hypothetically, like wargaming it, what will stop Maduro from maybe expanding his influence into Essequibo, Guyana, and unstable Colombia if the regime there falls? I mean, nothing. You're already a wanted man. So there's a lot of potential here, I think, for these regimes.
Well, specifically what happened on the Colombian-Venezuelan border, at least 39 people have been killed in the violence. And these are guerrilla groups that are supposedly backed by the Maduro government going into Colombia to fight in these territories that are controlled by these right-wing Colombian militias that, they use that area to stage, future incursions into Venezuela to disrupt the Maduro regime. But this is from the International. It says, on the first day of his term, Nicolas Maduro has warned that he's preparing an armed offensive with Cuba and Nicaragua in response to alleged foreign interventions. This is a quote, "We are preparing ourselves together with Cuba and Nicaragua and together with our older brothers in the world so that if one day we have to take up arms and defend the right to peace and sovereignty, we will fight in an armed struggle and win again. We are not lukewarm leaders. We are the Bolivarian Revolution." He said during the closing of the second meeting of the World Festival of the Anti-Fascist International, whose international delegates filled the seats of many representatives of democratic countries that turned their backs on him during the swearing-in ceremony. The Chavez leader thus responded to the request made this Saturday by former Colombian presidents Alvaro Uribe and Ivan Duque to undertake an international military intervention in Venezuela that would lead to a transition to democracy. "Coward, you come to the front of the troops. I'll wait for you in the battlefield," said Maduro, extending his insults against Uribe. And it just goes on to talk about he was sworn in for a sixth term, despite the fact that he arrested and banned all of the opposition. So things are closing in on Maduro. Colombia doesn't recognize him. I'm pretty sure everybody except, Nicaragua, Cuba, those are the people that he mentioned. These are very weak regimes. I just did a show this week. By the time you're listening to this, it might be out with Jose Nino. We talk a little bit about this. It's a great show. I recommend everybody listen to it. But, he talks about how he thinks the Cuban regime is very weak, as do I, and that they might end up facing some pretty big issues from the West as they, again, the guy in charge there, Diaz, he's no Castro. And Nicaragua, they're facing all sorts of international pressure because, they're like arresting priests and doing all sorts of crazy stuff there. So this coalition that Maduro has, clearly Russia and China are not quite as eager to openly support him. Obviously, they're tacitly supporting him, allowing him to stay in power. But clearly he is not their favorite friend right now, to say the least. But the other situations abroad, just to make sure we're covering all of our World War III bases, the situation in Sudan is escalating. Dozens of civilians killed in rapid support forces attack on Sudan's al-Jazeera state. A group says at least 21 civilians have been killed in attacks by the paramilitary rapid support forces in Sudan's al-Jazeera state this week. The attacks come as RSF launches a fresh offensive in villages south and east of al-Jazeera, following its defeat by the Sudanese armed forces and allied fighters in the strategic town of al-Qura and the state capital of Wad Madani earlier this week. And at the same time, this is from Daily Mail, the U.S. blacklists Sudan's army chief as Blinken regrets failure to end war. And this is not the rapid support forces. This is the actual Sudanese government that is fighting the terroristic UAE-backed rapid support forces. And I'm not saying that there's, cut and dry good guys and bad guys in this thing. It's an African proxy war. They're all very similar. But I'll read the article here. The United States on Thursday imposed sanctions on Sudan's army chief days after blacklisting his main rival, as outgoing Secretary of State Antony Blinken voiced great regret at his failure to end the brutal war. The Sudanese army has been at war with rival paramilitaries since April 2023 in a conflict that has killed tens of thousands of people and uprooted more than 12 million, including millions who face a worsening hunger crisis. The Treasury Department announced sanctions on Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the leader of the Sudanese armed forces, a week after similar actions against Mohammed Hamdan Daglo, Burhan's former deputy who leads the rival rapid support forces. So the U.S. doesn't even know who to sanction. They don't know who to back. They have no idea really how to end this conflict. I think in many ways they're having the same feeling in Sahel as, all the French forces leave. They're having similar feelings in some of their Middle Eastern proxies, of course, in Syria, as Israel and the Kurds are the only reason they have any justification for staying. So Blinken's, frustration as he's on his way out, I don't think that the Biden administration is going to be remembered as a particularly adept foreign policy administration, as they, I think, failed to walk the line, as it were, between being subservient to world Jewry and, trying to look out for human rights and be this liberal international regime, which, again, if you're going to support the Israeli genocide in Gaza, you kind of lose all of your claims to that. But unless you have anything to say on the situation in Africa, Dimitri, the situation in Korea, I know President Yoon is finally in jail. There's still some disputes there. People that support him are trying to claim this is all a North Korean Chinese coup, but ultimately he didn't actually end up getting forcibly arrested, despite the fact that he had hundreds of people protecting him at the presidential mansion. He ended up turning himself in to the prosecutor's office to avoid any kind of violence. But unless you have any comments on some of those last World War III fronts or Africa or Asia or anything like that, I'll leave you with any final church news or other news that we need to discuss here.
Yeah, I'll sort of start off with some of the blackbilling news, and then I'll give the really based. There are some monarchist news, right? And we like to cover that sort of stuff because it really kind of plays into the theme of the show when we do speak about the potential for future restoration of an Orthodox monarchy, in particular in Russia, which will definitely lead the way into the historical eschatological setting which the prophecies of the clairvoyant elders speak about. So kind of covering the news, generally speaking, the worst thing that's taken place this week, and this is probably the good thing because there's been no massive news of persecution, but the head of the State Service for Ethnopolicy and Freedom of Conscience, what a deceiving name, right? Essentially the head of the department in Ukraine, which looks at different religions and cults, Vladimir Zelensky has, not Zelensky, but Zelensky, or just an E. He's actually openly stated that they will be instituting a program across all of Ukraine to assess the representation and the veneration of various saints with Russian origins, starting with Alexander Nevsky, who, by the way, was a Russian prince and a miracle worker who lived just after the Mongol conquests in the middle of the 13th century. So this is 1230s, like a long time ago, during the time of St. John Vatazza, so 800 years ago, before the term Ukraine was never even uttered in the history of the earth. So there's a lot of weird signaling going on here. We already kind of foretold this and mentioned earlier that Ukrainians are already persecuting through their state government various Russian saints, removing icons of St. Nicholas II in particular, St. Elizabeth, and all other different saints who, again, are associated with a certain imperialistic Russian regime. Again, this is very anti-Orthodox, generally speaking. The other bizarre interview that was seen was by a very, we mentioned those journalists before, a very interesting physiognomy. We'll actually be posting this video on the Telegram shortly. His name is Vitaly Portnikov, a very famous journalist and award-winning journalist in Ukraine. Not very wealthy, but he, in an interview regarding the age of conscripts, being lowered to 18, he's sitting there kind of cross-legged, looking very Jewish, which he is, by the way. And the interviewer has asked, well, why is it that Ukrainian politicians and elites and people of wealth are not going to the front lines to fight? And he said, look, my friend, Ukraine is a democracy. We're not a feudal aristocratic regime. During the feudal ages, and he's saying this while he's giggling with a big smile on his face. And like, he looks hideous with the nose and the physiognomy and everything else as he's speaking about Ukrainians dying. He says, conscription and drafting is made for the poor people and for regular people in Ukraine because we are a democracy. And in liberal democracy, it's the regular people and people from lower classes that get drafted. In a feudal society, aristocrats and knights are drafted to fight in battle. But we are a liberal democracy, he says with a big smile. Like, it's...
Wow, thanks for making a great argument for monarchy, Mr. Jew.
It's almost like he's making a joke, but he's speaking about the lives and the depths of almost millions of Ukrainians at this point. We can almost say that hundreds and thousands at least. So very bizarre. And more interview news. So, of course, Natalia Poklonska has come out with her first interview confirming that she was asked, do you relate to Christianity at all? You used to be the chief procurator of Crimea. You were venerating Tsar Nicholas II. You were visiting Ganina Yama Monastery in Yekaterinburg and all these things. And she says, no, I'm completely a pagan anymore. I don't recognize my Lord Jesus Christ as a God anymore. So she's gone completely pagan, gone completely rogue. This, again, raises the question of women participating in electoral politics because she was a Russian member of the Duma, a member of the parliament for a little while after, of course, Crimea being annexed by the Russian Federation in 2014. And she went completely off the rocker, so to speak, and off the rails. It's very, we covered this a few months ago.
She hit the wall, right? She realized she got all the internet clout from everybody simping for her, but then she woke up one day and realized she was over 40 years old and not very beautiful, and I guess that just fried her brain.
Yeah, and she divorced her husband as well. So that, I don't know if that plays into it, but she became a priestess, a druidess, and now she believes in Slavic and Celtic paganism. So completely bizarre. Meanwhile, in the Ukrainian Duma, completely insane stuff happens. And this plays into the so-called peace talks and some of these agreements which people keep bringing up that, wow, well, when the peace talks happen, finally Ukraine will be free from Russian occupation and a division of Ukraine across the Dnieper River will be actually very beneficial, right? They keep saying this, but they don't realize that if that peace treaty takes place, like a Minsk Free happens, the Orthodox Christians on the western side of the Dnieper River will be persecuted because you have deputy of the Rada, Igor Guz. He's an open Banderite, so straight up neo-Nazi according to the Ukrainian sort of classification. He's been throwing up some sikhals back in the day during the Maidan. He openly stood up in the Rada, and he's from Volyn, which is far western Ukraine next to Lvov, so one of the most far western regions. He stated that him and his group are calling for the shutting down of all Orthodox Christian churches in his particular province and oblast, and they will be doing a church-to-church closing down of all the parishes, essentially shutting down Russian interests, which he associates with Orthodoxy. So this will definitely take place if a Minsk-free type of agreement, which does not include, of course, freedom of conscience and freedom of religion for the Orthodox Christians of Ukraine. If persecution does not end and there is a sort of like a peace line, a buffer zone is created, again, we have no guarantees that the persecution and these sort of crazy people will be sort of left restricted. And, the big sermon that I heard this week, of course, was from Metropolitan Theodosius of Cherkasy, the sort of long-suffering, whose cathedral was taken last year, the Cathedral Archangel Michael in the city of Cherkasy. Cherkasy is located on the Dnieper River. So as we can imagine, Conrad, on the 19th of January, during Theophany this Sunday, all the entire Dnieper River will essentially be baptized and blessed by all the various Orthodox Christian parishes, cathedrals, monasteries, making processions to the Dnieper River, where the Russian people were baptized over 1,000 years ago by Saint Vladimir and Saint Olga, and they will be blessing that river, and that entire river will be blessed. And Metropolitan Theodosius, his new sort of church and cathedral is located on the bank of the Dnieper River as well. In his sermon, he actually mentions that, Ukrainian people who are drafted forcefully should be not participating in any unlawful actions against their own conscience. He's not calling for Ukrainians to surrender to the Russians, but he's essentially saying that Ukrainians should really, really be thinking about how God will judge them for their actions on the front lines. And the analogy he gave was very interesting. He said that, just imagine during the reign of Herod the Great, during the persecution against the infants, when he was trying to kill the infant Christ, and Joseph and the Virgin Mary had to escape to Egypt for a time. There were probably Judean, Jewish, and Roman soldiers who were not obeying Herod, and they were probably not slaying any infants. And he says that you need to be like those soldiers who refuse to slay the infants and do not participate in any sort of bloodshed that goes against your conscience. He was telling his parishioners and those who have come around to sort of hear the sermon, which I think is a very good message. It kind of plays into the same messaging that we saw last week when we spoke about the soldiers who had unfortunately, their index fingers cut off when they refused to shoot at their fellow Orthodox Christian Russians in the Kursk Oblast. These are forcibly recruited Ukrainians. So again, this is the correct messaging. This is the Orthodox Christian way. It isn't pacifism. It's just simply living according to your conscience. If you're catechized, baptized into the Orthodox Church, this is living according to the tenets of the faith. So very important. And the good news, right? I mentioned the big monarchist news this week, coming from the Listva bookshop. And this is a massive library and bookshop located in St. Petersburg, where they give very based right-wing lectures in Russia. And most interestingly, over the last few years, I think the bookshop was only established since COVID, I believe. It's very new, but they sell very good right-wing historical Russian books. Nothing too extreme, so to speak, but it's a great place for Russians to obtain very rare materials which they can then study and promote their orthodoxy, Russian patriotism, and all these things in St. Petersburg. And at this bookstore, they have a large hall where certain figures give presentations. Igor Strelkov gave lectures there several times. Other Donetsk, Lugansk veterans and all these other big figures in the Russian right wing have given presentations there. And what's interesting is this week, a few days ago, actually, they had one of the best Russian right-wing historians, Dmitry Matlin, who I adore personally. He's the actual expert in Russia on specifically Alexander II and Alexander III. In fact, I think he knows more about Alexander II than anyone else in the whole world, in terms of he's read every single letter, every single book written about him. He's given many lectures about Alexander II. It's like his particular period that he specializes in, that late 19th century. But Dmitry Matlian, he's a big supporter of the SMO. He's personal friends with Strelkov, Gabriel Doroshin as well. And this is where this gets really interesting. He's very involved in the Russian right wing. And Dmitry Matlian gave a 2-hour lecture. And the lecture is very hard to find on YouTube, but we might link it in the comments if anyone's interested. It's completely in Russian, but I recommend anyone who knows Russian, you need to listen to it because it kind of describes where Russian monarchism is going. In the lecture, he talks about his involvement in the Russian monarchist movement in the 90s and how the Yeltsin government shut down any attempts by the Russian right wing to restore the monarchy during the canonization of the Romanovs. And he himself, Dmitry Matlian, was one of the organizers of inviting various descendants of the Romanov family to Russia during the Yeltsin years in order to introduce them to Yeltsin and other people in the Russian government to have the Romanov family at least participate in the restoration of Russia after the collapse of the USSR. He made very interesting comments throughout the lecture that these people in the Yeltsin government were sabotaging these efforts, which is why Russian monarchism today is not very supported by the ruling party. And this trend began in the Yeltsin years. The other interesting thing he said was towards the end, he began speaking about Gabriel Doroshin. And he said that in 2023, he received a phone call. In early 2023, Dmitry Matlian was called by Igor Strelkov personally on his mobile in the early months of 23. And he was told that there was a fighter on the front lines of the SMO named Gabriel Doroshin, and he was a descendant of Tsar and Emperor Nicholas I. And he said, and of course, Dmitry Matlian was like, no way, you're going to tell me some crazy story. Please don't make fun of me. Don't joke around. And Strelkov was like, no, I'm entirely serious. This is a Russian patriot. He knows all the things. And, we can confirm Gabriel Doroshin. He names the Jews openly all the time. He knows right-wing Russian Orthodox conservative thought. He's a very intelligent and very strong-willed young man. In fact, by young, I mean, he's 28 years old at this point, I believe. And he told Dmitry Matlian about him. And then Dmitry Matlian recalled that when he visited France in the 1990s, he actually met with the grandparents of Gabriel Doroshin because his grandfather was actually a deacon in the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, Rokor. His name was Father Sergius. And he met Father Sergius as well as Father Sergius's wife, who was Matushka Tatiana. And he said that they were the most wonderful people. Like, this deacon was just an amazing man. He unfortunately passed away in November of 2021. And then he mentioned that he went to their house for dinner at one point and he met their grandchildren. And of course, one of their grandchildren was Gabriel Doroshin as a young boy in the 90s. And he just said that this particular priest, what's interesting is he married this Matushka Tatiana, and turns out his wife Tatiana was a descendant of both Nicholas I, the emperor, and Eugene de Beauharnais, who is the adopted son of Napoleon. Of course, we're speaking about literally Napoleon, who his little adopted son, the son of Josephine. You can see him in that Napoleon movie that came out recently by Ridley Scott. The movie is ridiculous and utterly nonsense, I think, historically speaking. But you do see Eugene de Beauharnais, that future ancestor of Gabriel Doroshin, in the film for a few segments, that little boy that appears at the beginning. And at the end, of course, Dmitry Matlian, he gives this rundown of Gabriel Doroshin's ancestry, and he covers every single ancestor in depth. And it turns out that he's actually quite fond of him. And this is a leading monarchist in the Russian movement. And he states that he's a monarchist legitimist, and Gabriel Doroshin, on paper, does not have any rights to the throne of Imperial Russia. But he says that all the other descendants of the Romanov family have proven themselves either openly anti-Russia, like a few members of the Romanov family, unfortunately, in the US have come out in support of Ukraine, which is quite disturbing and somewhat disgusting. And it really shows that how a certain family can really fall in terms of prestige, especially when they've lived abroad for a while. And unfortunately, Prince George, right, probably the senior member of the Romanov family, he moved to Italy during the SMO. This is the man supported by Konstantin Malafeyev, our good friend. He's moved to Italy during the SMO, and he has failed to make any pro-Russian statements over the last 3 years entirely. He's just completely ignored the SMO, ignored supplying or helping Russians in humanitarian aid, in terms of even messaging of any sort. So Gabriel Doroshin is literally the only descendant of the Romanov family who comes from a very good, very traceable, very positive bloodline. His grandfather was a very esteemed, very positive deacon in France under the Russian Orthodox Church. And Dmitry Matlin at the end just says, well, I think I support Gabriel the Russian. If he becomes the Tsar, I'll be for it in terms of Russia's future, which was a huge statement to make, given that
Wow.
it shocked me because Dmitry Matlin is a very studious historian. He literally he knows the succession act that was passed down by Paul Romanov in the early 1800s. He knows exactly who the legitimate line of succession should go to. But generally speaking, Gabriel the Russian has really impressed him. And he met Gabriel the Russian's family. He knows them very well. It's just very impressive that he made that statement, but also very scary because hopefully Gabriel the Russian remains safe, because we do know what happens to legitimate pretenders to power in right-wing Christian countries throughout history. So, we should be keeping Gabriel the Russian in our prayers so that he kind of remains safe and that God kind of keeps him potentially for a future that may shock all of us, I think. But, this is maybe what the saints talk about in their clairvoyant prophecies.
That's really awesome news update there. And I'm really hoping we can talk to some of those guys, the ones that perhaps are more proficient in English, on the show sometime soon. And even those that aren't proficient in English, we would love to have them on for a conversation with Dmitry and then provide a subtitled or even dubbed version of that conversation for you guys. So let us know if that's something you're interested in, because we very much want to pursue that. And I'm going to give one final story, some good news as well to end things on. And this is very good news. This is from Ortho Christian. In October 2022, a court in Patras, Greece, convicted a well-known priest for having celebrated the Divine Liturgy on the Feast of the Annunciation in 2020 during the COVID pandemic. Proto-Presbyter Anastasios Gatsopoulos, who served in the Church of St. Nicholas in Patras on the day in question, received a suspended sentence of 8 months in prison. However, on Monday, January 13th, the criminal court unanimously overturned his conviction on appeal, reports the Union of Orthodox Journalists. The prosecutor's office agreed with the arguments of the lawyers who claimed that the Ministry of Health's decree prohibiting religious services for 20 days due to the pandemic was unconstitutional. The judges fully supported the prosecutor's position, also basing their decision on the conflict with priestly duties. The announcement of the acquittal was met with thunderous applause by the many clergy, monastics, and laymen who came to support Father Anastasios. In his defense, the priest stated, "It's impossible under any circumstances and for any reason to accept a ban on the celebration of the Divine Liturgy, even for one day. The cancellation of the liturgy, even temporary, means the abolition of the Church itself. Such laws were in effect in Europe until 311, during the time of Emperor Diocletian, and in Albania under Enver Hoxha from 1967 to 1990. Even Mehmed the Conqueror, Lenin, and Stalin didn't dare to implement such a sacrilegious cancellation of the liturgy, which the Greek Republic allowed. If this was a crime, I'm ready to bear responsibility," he concluded. "If your conscience and sense of justice find me guilty, condemn me. I accept this honor, the honor of being condemned for fulfilling my duty as an Orthodox priest." The court spared Greece from a great shame, he said. The Greek judicial system, through its acquittal, refused to apply the excessive, illogical, ineffective, unconstitutional, and above all blasphemous government decree that prohibit not only gatherings of believers in churches, but also the Divine Liturgy itself, even in monasteries and on Athos during Great Lent during 2020. Father Anastasios expressed his heartfelt gratitude to all of those who have supported him. And Father Anastasios is a very wonderful priest. He's written a lot of books, for example, The Jesus Prayer for People in the World. I've got a copy of that on my shelf. It's on my list. He's friends with Father Peter Heers, and he's told me wonderful things about him. So this is great news. Greece slowly but surely maybe repenting and asking for forgiveness from what it did to its holy people and to its priests and to its Christians during the COVID nonsense. So this is very good to see. And with all of that, I want to thank everybody so much for listening to this episode of World War Now. If you want to support the show, please consider becoming a paid subscriber, worldwarnow.co. That is our Substack link. And if you get behind the paywall, you get access to, at this point, 63 plus episodes of Ether Hour, our premium show. This week, we did a fantastic discussion on the history of central banking and how it's used as a Jewish control mechanism to enslave mankind and has been since even the pre-Christian days. We're joined by our friend Truth Teller about that, so that's linked below. Please don't miss that episode. We still have that Q&A thread up, so if you're already a paid subscriber, ask us a question, because in the next episode of Ether Hour, we're going to be answering all of those. So again, thank you so much for your support. I was on Jose Nino this week, so if that's up, be sure to follow us around. That link will be everywhere. Be sure to follow us on other socials as well, World War Now _ on X. Be sure to follow me on X at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Follow us on Rumble, World War Now. Subscribe to the YouTube channel, World War Now. Please, even if you're a Substack subscriber, head on over to the YouTube, subscribe, like the videos there too. It really helps us out. It helps the channel grow. And be sure to like and comment on Substack as well. It really helps us in the algorithm. But we're growing pretty fast recently, so I really want to thank all of our supporters, paid and unpaid. You really are the ones that make this show possible. We've also got the Discord, so if you're not over there yet, be sure to head over there. But yeah, worldwarnow.co, that's our home base. Please support us. It keeps the show going and everything, and keeps us doing the work that we love to do. But thank you so much for listening and making it here to the end. Dimitri, I will leave you with the last words.
Thank you, everyone, for listening until the end. It's been another long episode, and I wish everyone celebrating Theophany on the old calendar this Sunday, the 19th of January, to really enjoy the feast day, especially, and we'll be watching what happens in Israel, in Palestine, where they, of course, every Theophany feast day, as you know, the Jordan River flows from the Mount Hebron all the way into the Dead Sea. And when they make their way to the place where St. John the Baptist baptized our Lord Jesus Christ, they submerge the Holy Cross in the water, and they, of course, proclaim the baptism of the Lord, the Theophany. And then, of course, a miracle takes place, which one of the few and rare miracles that takes place in the Holy Land, just like the coming down of the fire on the Holy Sepulchre on Easter, and just like the cloud over Mount Tabor on Transfiguration. They say that every now and then the waters of the Jordan either start stirring in a circle or something happens to the Jordan River. At times, even the Jordan turns on itself. So normally the Jordan's supposed to flow from north to south, but for a moment, as the cross is submerged into the water and as the priests sing their prayers regarding Theophany, and on this holy feast day on the 19th, the waters of the Jordan flow from south to north. So it's one of these rare miracles where the Lord really shows his power. And it all takes place on the Julian calendar. So this is why the Church of Jerusalem still holds to these very ancient traditions. And glory to God, and hope we all celebrate Theophany this week in earnest, and definitely appreciate all the time that we have here on earth to celebrate these great feast days.
Thank you guys for listening. Christ is baptized.